Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. The third pillar of Islam is Zakat. Now, essentially, Zakat is a mandatory charity that is given from the rich to the poor, and there are a lot of different rules surrounding how it's calculated, depending on the source, be it physical cash, or gold, or silver, or inventory for sale, or livestock, or precious metals, or other financial instruments. Allah commands us to give Zakat in the Quran, chapter 9, verse 103, when He states, "Take from their wealth a charity that will cleanse them and purify them." As we've covered before in our video on the pillars of Islam, many Muslims push this idea that Zakat is a way of purifying our impermissible sources of income. But Allah clearly states in the Quran that Zakat is for the purpose of purifying our character and purifying our souls. If Zakat is distributed properly, it will have many direct and indirect impacts on you as an individual, on your character, on your spirituality, and then again, towards the society that you live in. Zakat is a powerful tool in the development of the character of the human being, because as Muslims, we should be reflecting on all that Allah has blessed us with. And we should know that what we have is by the grace of God, and our gratitude for what Allah has granted us should cause us to want to give from that which what we have been given. While generosity in and of itself is a form of good character, it also develops a trust and reliance upon Allah, as we're able to give without fear of loss, and we're able to give knowing that the one who gave it to us in the first place can give it back to us many times over, be it in this life or in the next. So to be able to give is a testament to the level of faith that the individual has. And the more that one gives, the more that it develops their character and affirms their relationship with Allah. Zakat is a powerful tool for developing our character with the society around us, because the concept that we should give to the poor dictates that we should have a connection with the people who are less fortunate than us. You cannot have good character in a vacuum. It requires context. And our context is the society that we live in, and the friends, family, neighbors, and even the enemies that make up that society. In Islam, when we have a mandatory action that is not completed except by a specific means, then that means in and of itself becomes mandatory. If it is your responsibility to give to the poor, then it is mandatory upon you to know who to give it to. And how can you know who to give it to if you're not a part of that society in which those people live? Unfortunately, many Muslims have removed themselves from interacting with the society, hiding inside of their centers to the point where you hear some of them claim that they don't know anybody in need, despite the fact that if they were engaged in the society around them, they would realize that there are most certainly people in your neighborhood or on your street that are in need of assistance. There's a foolish idea held by many Muslims in America that there are no poor people here. So they send all of their money back home or to impoverished Muslim countries. Unfortunately, anybody that isn't locked up in some expatriate compound knows that not only are there poor people in America, but that a large portion of this country is struggling to get by. And many of those people who are struggling are also American Muslims. So the idea that you can't find anyone in need of your charity is just a symptom of how isolated and out of touch those communities have become. And it's sad that millions of dollars are sent overseas when Islam dictates that you take care of those who are in your vicinity before you go out of your village or your country or your state, never mind your country. And the idea that you don't know anybody who is poor would lead me to believe that you don't understand the purpose of Zakat, or you're not looking hard enough. The fact that Zakat should be given to the poor would necessitate that you actually know who those people are. And if you know that Zakat is going to be required of you, then you should be seeking those people out throughout the year. Muslims have destroyed this very beautiful practice through the modernization of Zakat, with all of these nonprofit foundations where thousands of needy families in our localities are skipped over so that we can send funds to another country, when it's mandatory for us to take care of those that are closest to us first. On top of that, Zakat, when given to the needy, is supposed to be given to them to the extent that it takes care of them for the year. But if you go to an Islamic center or organization to receive funds, you'd be lucky to get that which covers a third of your monthly expenses. When funds are distributed, it's rarely hand in hand. People prefer to pay through an app, which is so impersonal, or they donate to the masjid, which prevents you from having any real connection with those in need. On top of that, it's questionable at best if all of those funds that you're giving to these organizations actually use those funds for their designated purposes. It is not difficult to find those in need if you actually try. Just find one and you'll find them all. Poor people know poor people, just like rich people know rich people. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was the most generous, and he was far from inaccessible to the poor and less fortunate. Our charity, be it in giving time or knowledge or services or in finances should not be limited to once in a year, but zakat is just the foundation of establishing our commitment to charity and being generous as Muslims. As Muslims, we should be generous, and our acts of kindness and involvement in the community should put us in a position where we don't need to ask who are those in need, because we already know them, because we're in touch with our community, because Islam calls us to be of service and holds us accountable for being of service to our neighbors, because we're to be a mercy to mankind. We should have genuine concern for the welfare of the people that are around us. We are kind and we are generous because this is what Islam calls us to be, because this was the message of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Giving zakat builds character, initially challenging you to part with something you value, which is your wealth. As your faith grows, however, it evolves into an act of desire, where you willingly share with others what Allah has provided you. This should develop the desire in the believer to not only give that which is mandatory, but to give that which is not, so that you develop the character trait of generosity. So no, zakat is not a method by which you purify your income that you made off of gambling or liquor sales or lottery tickets or usury or cheating and misleading other people. You don't right those wrongs through zakat. You right those wrongs through correcting them and seeking forgiveness and giving the rights back to the people whom you took them from. Zakat is not an expiatory action. Zakat has another purpose altogether, as we've outlined. So when it comes to zakat, we have to go over 4 things. Number 1 is who gives zakat. Number 2 is who receives it. Number 3 is what are the types of wealth that zakat is paid on. And number 4 is how do you calculate what you owe in zakat. As for who gives zakat, there are 2 conditions. The first condition is that the individual must possess the necessary amount to qualify to give zakat. In Arabic, we refer to this as the nisab. In this video, we'll refer to this as the threshold amount. If you possess the threshold amount of the specified resource, then you've met one condition. The second condition is that you have to have possessed the threshold amount for the entire specified time. For some items, this requires holding the threshold amount for an entire lunar calendar year, which in Arabic we refer to as al-hawl. It is important to emphasize that al-hawl, or the calendar year, is in reference to the lunar or Islamic calendar year, which is about 10 days less than the Gregorian calendar. The nisab, or the threshold amount, will vary based on the commodity, but for most people, they're going to be dealing with currency, which is going to be calculated at the value of either gold or silver. Now, some commodities do not require a full calendar year of possession, but rather they are due once you possess that said commodity, such as crops at harvest time. In order for zakat to be mandatory, on the most basic level, you have to maintain a level of wealth above the specific threshold for a full lunar calendar year. Then you are to take a designated portion of that wealth and give it to those in need, so long as they meet certain criteria. For most people, their wealth is primarily in the form of currency, which is measured again against either gold or silver. Now, the threshold for gold is that one needs to hold at least 85 grams of gold, which as of today's recording is equivalent to $7,170. Additionally, this wealth must be held for a full lunar calendar year. So if you possessed $7,170 and you held that amount for a full lunar calendar year, then you would owe 2.5% of that in zakat, which would equate to $179.25. Nothing that would break the bank. Now, it's important to note that the price of gold and silver fluctuate throughout the year, so these numbers are constantly changing. Now, if at any point your wealth dipped below that threshold of the value of 85 grams of gold within a full lunar calendar year, then you do not owe zakat, even if your wealth dipped below that threshold amount for just one day. So for example, if you had $8,000 in the bank for 10 months and then you spent all of it, and then the next day you got paid bonuses that brought you up to $10,000, you wouldn't owe zakat until the new amount that you possessed was held for a full lunar calendar year. So if at any point your wealth dips below that threshold amount, your lunar calendar year for zakat stops, and it doesn't start again until you possess the threshold amount. And it is not owed unless you possess the threshold amount or more for a full lunar calendar year from the month that that wealth passed the threshold amount. If you never possess the threshold amount, then you would never owe zakat. The threshold amount that makes one required to give zakat varies based on the type of wealth, and we'll go over that shortly. Now, with regards to who receives zakat, Generally speaking, zakat is mandatory upon Muslims who have wealth and given to Muslims who do not. But there are 8 categories of people that are eligible for zakat, and those are the poor, the needy, those employed to collect or administer zakat, those whose hearts have been inclined towards Islam, for the freeing of slaves, for those who are in debt, for Allah's cause, and the wayfarers. So for the first 2 categories, they are referred to in Arabic as al-fuqara and al-masakin, which get translated from Arabic to English as the poor and the needy. It may be more accurate to use the terms absolute poverty and relative poverty, but essentially we have 2 types of poor people. The scholars have described the first as those who do not have what suffices them for a full calendar year, and the second are those who don't have half of what suffices them for a full calendar year. In layman's terms, we're basically talking about people who are broke and people who are struggling to get by. And Allah knows that we have no shortage of either in our country. Both of these types of people qualify for zakat. So obviously anybody who's homeless or begging on the street, to people whose fridge is empty and the house is cold because they can't afford to buy food or add oil to their tank. Again, this is one of the most frustrating things about the Muslim community, because if you're a convert, you know that a lot of the country falls into these 2 categories. And the vast majority of converts are not coming from families that set them up with a trust fund. And we have many inner city communities with brothers and sisters who are not well off. And while the Muslims like to brag about how successful they are in America and therefore would be required to pay zakat, unfortunately, many continue to act as if there are no poor people here and send their zakat overseas. The third category of zakat eligible recipients are those who are employed by the state or the ruler to administer zakat. And they are those who collect it, those who assign it, and those who distribute it. These are not people who assign themselves to collect zakat, either by starting their own nonprofit or individuals volunteering for organizations to collect and administer zakat. Rather, these are people that are assigned by the state and are paid for their work according to their efforts from the state out of the money collected for zakat. The fourth category are those whose hearts are inclined to Islam. Now, the majority of scholars have said that this means new Muslims that have recently accepted Islam to strengthen their faith and as a means of encouraging their peers to become Muslims as well. Now, some scholars have gone to the extent that this also includes those who have a fondness for Islam or the Muslims, and it is thought that by giving them zakat, it may help in bringing them closer to accepting Islam. And this is specifically the case for individuals who hold power or influence among their people. But as with any category, we should first take care of those who are the obvious intended recipients before we look to secondary and tertiary interpretations for the recipients of zakat. And again, there is no shortage of people who embrace Islam who could benefit from being recipients of zakat. The fifth category is for the purpose of freeing Muslim slaves, either by purchasing them to set them free or by paying off whatever remaining debt that they are required to pay to their master before he or she sets them free. Some scholars have said that this category includes the freeing of Muslim prisoners of war, but otherwise this category is going to be obsolete for us in our context, so we're not going to focus on it. The sixth category is for those who are in debt. These are individuals who are in debt of their own accord. For example, this could be somebody who took out a loan, either to meet his or her own needs, or to purchase something that he or she needs that they didn't have money for. This could be money owed on payments for things such as rent, a car, an electric bill, or medical bills that the individual does not have the money to pay. This debt must be paid off from the zakat funds so long as the individual doesn't have any wealth that could be used to pay off the debt themselves. The seventh category is for those who are striving for Allah's cause. Some people try to make this category to mean everything and anything that is supportive of the religion or charitable, which is not correct. Because if you say that it means all of these alternative acts of goodness or charity, it nullifies the point of Allah limiting the recipients of zakat when Allah specified who they were. And that would reduce zakat to being just any form of charity that is supportive of the religion and the believers. For obvious reasons, you're not going to be giving zakat to this category. And beware of people who are encouraging you to do so. I don't encourage anyone to send money to any organizations in general, and definitely not to any organizations outside of the country you reside in, regardless of whatever they are claiming to do. Living in the US, you may or may not be aware, but certain groups or organizations or individuals affiliated with certain organizations could get you in a lot of legal trouble if you are found to be sending them funds. My advice here is there are plenty of people in the US in need of your zakat funds, and there is no need to send your money elsewhere. But if you ever do send money overseas, make sure you check with the State Department with regards to whoever you're sending funds to in order to avoid any legal troubles. The last and eighth category of Zakat recipients are the wayfarers. These are travelers who are cut off from everything and have no money. An example would be somebody who is visiting from out of state or from another country, and they lost their wallet or it was stolen, and they have no access to money or cards to make purchases. This could be somebody who is just traveling cross country and ran out of cash and can't afford food or gas. Such a traveler may be given enough zakat to enable him to reach his destination, even if he or she is rich, because they are needed at that moment. Next, we want to talk about the types of wealth that zakat is paid on and how to calculate zakat. But before we do, one thing you have to understand before we move forward is that zakat is just another one of those areas where there are a lot of different opinions that start to emerge, especially as we talk about modern financial instruments. We'll have an entire video explaining why there are so many different opinions in Islam. But for now, what you have to understand with regards to zakat is the following. Whenever you have a situation where you want to know the Islamic ruling for that situation, and that situation doesn't have a precedence where there is an exact replica for that situation during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, you are almost certain to have differences of opinion on how to interact with that situation. So for example, if we have gold, you know how to pay zakat on gold because the Prophet, peace be upon him, explicitly explained how to do so. But since that time, there are many new financial instruments and situations that didn't exist, such as fiat currencies or with regards to stocks, bonds, ETFs, IRAs, indexes, mutual funds, 401ks, etc. So what happens is scholars use the evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah and look at the most relatable situations from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to see how they can apply those rulings to similar situations that we deal with in our current time. And because to some extent there is personal perspective involved when looking at these issues, you're bound to find differences of opinion. My point here is to say this: do not overly concern yourself with these differences of opinion at such an early stage in your Islam. If for some reason you were to get it wrong because you followed something your teacher taught you, the blame is going to be on them. Your job is to seek information from those that are knowledgeable. It's the job of those that are knowledgeable to tell you the correct information or to say that they don't know so that you can find someone who does. Now, there are many categories of items that you pay zakat on, such as gold, silver, inventory for sale, certain crops, certain livestock, buried treasure, and many of these categories have subcategories. We're going to focus on the ones that are most relevant that the average person is going to need to pay zakat on. There are certainly cool categories like camels and buried treasure, but because there are only 3,000 camels in the US and they are most likely not owned by any of you, and the likelihood that you found Blackbeard's treasure buried in your backyard is not very good, we're not going to go into the details of how you calculate zakat for the rare occasion that you happen to possess these items. The first category we're going to discuss is gold. And although most of you don't have bars of gold at home, it's important to know because gold and silver are used to calculate the threshold for fiat or paper currencies like the dollar. So the threshold for gold is 85 grams. If you possess 85 grams or more of gold for a full lunar calendar year, then you are going to pay 2.5% of that value in gold. The second category is silver, and the threshold for which is 595 grams of silver. If you possess 595 grams or more of silver for a full lunar calendar year, then you are going to pay 2.5% of the value of that silver in zakat. The third category for which zakat is paid on is modern fiat currencies, as they've taken the place of these precious metals as currency between the people. In order to calculate the threshold for currency, you would base it on its value compared to gold or silver. So for example, the threshold for dollars today, based on the value of 85 grams of gold, which as of the date of this recording is $7,170. So in order to be required to pay zakat, you would need to have $7,170 and hold that amount of wealth for a full lunar calendar year. The amount owed on $7,170 would be $179.25. Zakat is owed so long as you possess the threshold amount for a full lunar calendar year, and you would pay zakat on the entire amount that you possessed, not just the threshold amount. So if you had $10,000, for example, you would owe $250. If you had $100,000, you would owe $2,500. You could also calculate it off of silver, which as of today, 595 grams of silver would be worth $603.54. And the amount owed on that amount would be $15.09. Now, obviously, there's a big discrepancy between the two amounts. And that's because during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the threshold for gold and silver were used because they had the same value in relation to the currency at the time. Over time, the differences in the value of these two thresholds became quite large, and because of this, there are disagreements about whether to use the value of gold or silver with regard to the threshold for paper currency. I do not want to drag this video out or make it any more confusing, but understand that there are valid arguments on both sides for using the threshold for gold over silver, as well as using silver over gold. And to some extent, it's going to come down to perspective. So don't be surprised if someone holds one opinion over the other. Many of our contemporary scholars argue in favor of using whichever of the two commodities thresholds is less, as they believe it's more considerate to the poor, as it forces more people to pay zakat, and Allah knows best. So currently the value of silver is less than gold, so they would suggest that you calculate your zakat based on the threshold for silver, which is the value of 595 grams of silver. The fourth category for which zakat is paid on is inventory or trade goods for sale. These are any goods that you possess for the purpose of selling for profit. So if you own a grocery store or a clothing store or a car dealership, you're going to calculate the value of the goods in the store based on their sale price and combine that with any cash reserves for the business. And if that level of value is above the threshold for gold or silver, and you hold that level of value for a full lunar calendar year, then you would pay 2.5% of the combined total value for your cash reserves for the business and the sale price of your goods or inventory that the business has for sale. Now, it's important to note that buildings, transportation, appliances, machinery, or furniture that's used to run the business, but that are not for sale, are not included in calculating the value of your inventory. For example, if you own a supermarket and at any point throughout the year, the calculated value of your inventory at its sale price is $1 million, then you're clearly going to be obligated to pay zakat. You're calculating the total value of all the goods for sale, whether on the shelf or in storage, and you're calculating them at their sale price. However, you're not including the value of the building or the equipment like refrigerators, lights, shelving, or cash registers, or any other items that are used to run the business. So if that total value of your inventory for sale and your cash reserves equals or is above the threshold amount for a full lunar calendar year, and at the time of paying zakat, the value was $1 million, then you're going to pay 2.5% of that, which is equal to $25,000 in zakat. On the other hand, if you have a business where you're a landscaper, where you are selling a service or custom building products for people, but you don't hold inventory for sale, then you are paying zakat on your profits as you have no inventory for sale. Another example that would fall under the category of inventory is if you purchase land or real estate with the intent to buy and resell. It's treated like any other commodity and falls under the same category as inventory. If the value of your holdings meets the zakat thresholds and you hold that value for a full lunar calendar year, you would then pay 2.5% on the total value of your holdings. For example, if you own a company that buys and flips houses and you have 5, 10, or even 100 homes in your portfolio at any given time, you would calculate the sale value of those homes. If the value of those properties you possess is above the threshold of zakat for a full lunar calendar year, then you would pay 2.5% in zakat based on the sale value of your total holdings, once 1 year has passed from the time your holdings reach that threshold. On the other hand, if you have real estate that is not for the purpose of buying and selling, but is used for the purpose of rental properties, then you would not pay zakat on the value of the properties. You would only pay zakat on the income that is generated from those properties if that income, when combined with your other cash reserves, reaches the threshold amount and you hold that amount for a full lunar calendar year. It is important to note that any land or real estate that you own for your own personal use is not included in zakat. So if you have 2 different homes at 2 different parts of the country and 3 vacation homes and a condo in the city that are for your own personal use, then you do not owe zakat on the value of these properties because they are intended for personal use. Another example of trade goods and inventory is if you own stocks. Now, stocks can be complicated, and there are a lot of different opinions about how to pay zakat on them. First, you need to know that stocks are going to fall into 2 categories. Stocks that you own for the purpose of buying and selling throughout the year, such as a day trader. And then you have stocks that people own for the purpose of holding and benefiting from the dividends and the long-term growth in value. If you own stocks for the purpose of buying and selling throughout the year, then you are going to treat those stocks as if they are inventory for sale, like items in your storefront. If the value of your portfolio of stocks plus your cash reserves equals the threshold and you possess that value for a full lunar calendar year, then you would pay 2.5% on the market value of your total value of stocks and cash reserves. For example, if you're a day trader, you would use the market price to determine the value of the stocks that are in your portfolio. If the total value reaches the Zakat threshold for gold or silver and maintains that value or more for a full lunar calendar year, then you would pay 2.5% of their value in Zakat. Your lunar calendar year would not stop and start every time you bought and sold stocks. So if your portfolio of stocks plus your cash reserves are valued above the threshold, for example, at $10,000, and stays there for a full lunar calendar year, then you would owe $250 in Zakat. The second scenario is if you're purchasing stocks in various companies or indexes and you're holding on to them for the dividends or long-term increases in value. In this scenario, there are strong differing opinions. Some scholars say that you treat these stocks similar to how you would treat real estate that you hold for income earned through rent, and therefore you only pay Zakat on the dividends if that amount reaches the threshold amount when added to your other cash reserves, if you hold that value for a full lunar calendar year. In that case, you would pay 2.5% on those earnings in Zakat. Other scholars say that your ownership of stocks makes you part owner of the company, and therefore you would calculate the value of the inventory of that company or the Zakat eligible assets that that company holds, and then pay Zakat on the percentage of that company that your stocks represent. I know this can be confusing, and it can become even more confusing when you consider that most people own stocks in multiple companies or indexes and mutual funds, and you're probably saying, wait a second, so what's the right opinion? And here is an excellent opportunity for a side lesson, which is if whoever is teaching you has an answer for everything, they most certainly know far less than they project that they do. This is not my area of expertise. I personally don't feel comfortable saying this or that is the definitive correct answer that Allah would dictate as the correct opinion. It's not a hill I'd die on. If someone else feels comfortable presenting themselves as an expert on this matter, then let them do so. I'm sure some people will chastise me for even introducing this topic in the first place or explaining that there are differences of opinion, but these are commonly held sources of income. So I do think it's important that you understand Zakat is required on them, even if the when and the how is a source of disagreement amongst the scholars. My advice is to find someone in your area who specializes in these financial instruments, who is qualified with a background in Islamic law and a background in finance, who can help you calculate your required Zakat. The fifth category for which Zakat is due are certain agricultural products. In order for Zakat to be mandatory, they must meet two conditions. The first is that they must be products that are measured, and the second is that they must be products that are stored. So for example, Zakat is due on wheat, barley, dates, raisins, and things like almonds, because they're agricultural products that can be measured, and they're agricultural products that can be stored. You would not pay Zakat on things such as apples or tomatoes, because if you store them, over time they'll rot. The threshold for crops is approximately 675 kilograms, or about 1,488 pounds. This means you would need to have a sizable farm and harvest to be liable for Zakat, as that's a significant amount of barley, dates, or other crops you might be growing. However, remember that Zakat on crops is only applicable to agricultural crops that can be measured and stored. Unlike other types of wealth, there's no requirement to hold the crops for a full lunar calendar year, as Zakat on crops is paid once they're harvested and is given in the form of the crops itself. Now, the amount that is paid in Zakat for crops depends on how it's watered. If it's watered naturally without any expense or assistance from the farmer, such as from rainwater or natural irrigation, then 10% is owed in Zakat. If it's watered with assistance from the farmer, for example, you have water pumps or sprinklers, then 5% is owed in Zakat. If it's watered both naturally and by assistance from the farmer, then 7.5% is owed in Zakat, so long as you hold the threshold amount. Now, honey is its own special category. The threshold for honey is approximately 62 kilos or 137 pounds. And it's due upon harvest. The amount that is to be paid on the harvest, if it meets or surpasses the threshold amount, is 10% of the total harvest. The sixth category of Zakat is grazing livestock animals, and those animals for which Zakat is owed specifically are camels, cows, sheep, and goats. Just like silver, gold, currencies, and trade goods, to pay Zakat on these animals, you would need to possess a certain threshold, and you would need to possess that threshold or more for a full lunar calendar year. A third condition is placed on livestock, which is that they must graze freely at least half of the year. For those of you who are livestock owners, which I imagine are very, very few of you, we'll go over this subject more once we go over a book of fiqh or Islamic law on our website. I don't want to get too bogged down into the weeds in this video. So if this happens to be you, just reach out and we'll help you calculate whatever it is that you've got going on. But as this video is for the average person and the average person doesn't have camels, cows, sheep, or goats, we're not going to go into this in detail. For those of you who do happen to have a farm, just understand that you do not owe zakat unless you have the equivalent or more of 5 camels, 30 cows, or 40 sheep, or 40 goats, as those are the threshold amounts for each animal group, and you must possess that amount for a full calendar year. If you don't have the threshold of these animals for a full lunar calendar year, then you don't owe zakat. If you do happen to have 5 camels or 40 goats roaming around your property and you want to understand how to pay zakat on them, just reach out. I'm very accessible. Next, we want to discuss what happens when you have wealth, but you don't possess it because you lack access to it or because you lent it to someone. With regards to if somebody owes you money, generally speaking, you should still consider that money part of your calculation when seeing if you meet the threshold for paying zakat. But there are 3 scenarios with regards to debt that is owed to you. And the first is that the one who owes you money acknowledges that they owe you money and they're willing to pay you. Then you need to add this money to your calculation for the threshold as well as your lunar calendar year. On the other hand, if the one who owes you this debt acknowledges it but cannot pay it, or they deny it and refuse to pay it, then you do not owe zakat on that money, nor should you include it in your calculations for the threshold or the lunar calendar year. If at some point that individual does pay you back, then you should pay zakat on that money for 1 year if it met the thresholds on its own or when included with your other wealth. Now, some people would argue that retirement funds such as 401ks or SEP IRAs would fall under this category because generally speaking, you cannot access them without incurring a penalty. Others would argue that although you would incur a penalty, you still do have access to them and therefore you should pay zakat on them. And in some instances, you can access them without incurring a penalty at all. Once again, seek out somebody who specializes in Islamic finance and who has legitimate credentials with a background in Islamic law and a background in finance so that they can assess your personal situation and help you figure out what you have to do if you hold such financial instruments. Now that you know what zakat is, what categories of wealth require zakat, who pays it, and who it's given to, there's always the question of how much do we give each person or category of people. This is extremely important because there seems to be a common misconception among Muslims that zakat should be given to assist but not solve a problem. Like, we want to help, but only a little. I've worked in Islamic centers that distribute zakat, and it has always bothered me that you see someone come in and they are in need of $3,000, for example, just to make it through the month. And the center has the money in zakat funds, but then they debate about the situation and then give the person only $500. As if the idea is to give them just enough to make a small dent, but not to really make a meaningful impact. The reality is that zakat should be given to the extent that it solves the problem if possible. If someone doesn't have the funds to get them through the year, then you give them the funds to get them through the year. If that ends up being $20,000, so be it. And if you have the money, then you get it to the person. If someone needs $5,000 to repair their car and get back to their home state, then if you have it in zakat funds, you should give it to them. Obviously, there's something to be said about distributing the zakat to multiple people where there's scarcity of funds and trying to help out as many different people as possible. But we're in a situation where millions of dollars are sent overseas or given to organizations under the idea that they qualify for zakat, which is highly debatable, while we pass over people whose houses are cold and their fridge is empty and they're late on rent. When giving zakat, priority should be given to those with the greatest need and to those who are closest to you in vicinity. Unfortunately, the Muslim community does the opposite. We give to people in other countries and we make up categories while skipping over those that are clearly specified in the Islamic texts. It does not make sense to skip over thousands of people who are in need within your state to send money to the other side of the country, never mind on the other side of the planet, especially when zakat is to be paid in the land that the wealth was generated. Unfortunately, many politicians in the Muslim community push for the idea that the categories of recipients for zakat can mean any multitude of things. So zakat money that should be going to the poor and those in need ends up being spent on masjid expenses or Islamic schools for the select families that can afford to send their children to these institutions, which, if we're being honest, are actually Muslim cultural schools with the word Islamic attached to it in order to justify fundraising and somehow qualify for zakat. Regardless, your zakat should be going to the people Allah specified, and there is no shortage of them. As converts to Islam, we need to revive these practices amongst the believers. We need to be engaged with the community around us so that we know who is in need in order to give to our brothers and sisters locally. And we need to make sure that zakat gets to those that need it to the extent that we can make a real impact instead of some superficial gesture. Zakat is one of the pillars of Islam. Although it may seem daunting to learn all of the different rules for zakat that pertain to your different types of wealth, always remember that these are opportunities for worship and are not just obligations that you need to get out of the way. If Allah blessed you with wealth, make sure you respond to that blessing with gratitude, expressed through giving that which is owed to the poor through zakat. And may that be an entryway to you giving generously beyond that which is required of you.